Hi, I'm Alan Bell and welcome to my 10-year market forecast for iron ore. So, what is iron ore? Iron ore is found predominantly as rock comprising an iron content. In Australia it is found predominantly in two forms, hematite and magnetite. Although as you can see from the table and graphics, iron ore can be found in many different types with many different compositions. So where is iron ore found? Well, as is evident on screen, it is found widely around the world, but only in a relatively small number of countries in a significant economic quantity, although every year more deposits are continually discovered, so the reserve values presented on screen really only represent reserves known as of 2016. Also evident on screen is the significant contribution to total annualized world iron ore extraction and supply by Australia, with very nearly all of it delivered to market from Western Australia. The vast majority of Australian, Brazilian and South African iron ore is exported to China. This next slide simply shows that iron ore is the primary ingredient for the manufacturing of steel. Virtually all iron ore mined is purchased to produce steel, and very nearly all Australian iron ore is exported to China, Japan or Korea. The other key ingredients for the initial production of crude iron are thermal or coking coal for heat and limestone for the removal of impurities through the generation of slag. Following on from the previous slide, this slide presents the relative raw material quantities required for the production of 1 ton of steel. As we've seen, iron ore is mined and processed to produce steel. But what is the steel that is produced? Well, the steel making process either ends with slabs or billets for later reheating and end product manufacture, or otherwise carries straight on through the production process to take the form typically as one of the listed primary steel products. This state effectively ends the steel making process. So the steel products produced typically feed what demand? The graphics depict the primary economic activities demanding the consumption of steel and therefore iron ore. Manufacturing and consumer goods, building and infrastructure, light industry and heavy industrial. So where is the growing demand for Australian iron ore coming from? Well, as you can see from the chart on the right of the world's major economies, China and India are growing GDP easily faster and by a factor of 3 or more that of the other nations. The growth numbers are simply staggering. When population figures are recognised, with China and India possessing a combined 36% of the world's population, with population growth easily outstripping Western countries. So with the growth and population bases considered, it becomes easy to understand the growing enormity of these markets. This slide presents the non-price determinants of demand for iron ore. Firstly, building and construction methods are increasingly using prefabricated and modular construction methods which incorporate or comprise of steel components to speed construction time and deliver stronger constructed products. With respect to substitutes, iron in the form of steel does not really have any economically competitive substitutes. On future pricing, China has historically buffered against pricing spikes with stockpiles of a few months' production volumes, but this comes at a cost and an inconvenience of managing such inventory. Customer income levels in emerging economies are on the rise, and with the increased income levels comes increased demand for infrastructure, industrial, residential, and consumer property. Therefore, the market size is global and growing. These emerging markets go close to representing near half of the world's population. A notable point is that with all the steel in situ, this in itself creates a forward demand for steel via maintenance and upkeep. Now we turn our focus to the supply side. This slide presents a pictorial presentation of supply side logistics from left to right, top to bottom of the supply chain process for the extraction and delivery of iron ore to market. Now we turn to the non-price determinants of supply. Being able to compete competitively on the cost of production is critical given the scale and the volumes of production. Taxation, royalties, levies and subsidies are not really too relevant as the major producer countries do not markedly differ in application of these mechanisms. It is notable that Australia a few years ago rejected a direct specific mining tax. Forward planning for supply of expected demand needs considerable planning in finance and engineering of capital investment. Australia tends to lead the way on this. The price of thermal coal is particularly relevant, but interestingly, it tends to move in a high correlation with the price of iron ore. There is a high number of international suppliers, but relatively few of competitively significant scale. Technology and automation are key for achieving maximized output and achieving economies of scale in production, thus reducing the per ton cost of production. Safety and environmental considerations are also hugely significant as they are both potentially costly but also politically relevant. Risk management and mitigation are absolutely necessary overheads which add to the cost of production. This slide presents the relative cost per tonne for the various producer countries. Notable are the huge production volumes of Australia and Brazil, which cannot be matched by the other producers, whilst the cost of production per tonne for Australia and Brazil are mid-range, although likely to be more accurate. This next slide for demonstration presents the highly correlated pricing movements of iron ore and thermal coal through the year of 2016. Further to the previous slide, this slide presents the pricing movements for iron ore and thermal coal for the last 20 years. Both charts show relatively similar pricing movements, so it is easy to recognize the high price movement correlation. This slide presents the growing supply capacity of Australian production and the significant growth investments being made. These investments should lift the Australian supply capacity from 825 million tonnes per annum up to circa 1.25 billion tonnes per annum. A few quick facts. 98.5% of Australian production comes from WA, 81% of Australian production is exported to China, 9% to Japan and 7% to Korea. According to the World Steel Association, 2018 global steel demand totaled 1.66 billion tonnes and is expected to grow 1.4% to 1.68 billion tonnes for 2019. Unfortunately, mining safety and environmental impacts are real and come with a social and economic cost. This slide presents the most recent Vale catastrophe at Parapita River as a result of the settling dam collapse which killed hundreds of people, and bottom right the preceding Samarco disaster in 2015 which killed 19. Both disasters caused massive economic impacts to other industries and the natural environment too. This slide presents the immediate iron ore market pricing reaction following on from the most recent Parapita River disaster, clearly shown as a significant price jump following the incident and demonstrates the market reaction to uncertainty of supply arrangements. This next slide presents a 10-year look back to 2009, which again demonstrates the huge exports that flowed to China when world iron ore production totaled 1.3 billion tonnes per annum. Finally, to draw all the information together into a 10-year look ahead, we start with 2009 and the 1.3 billion tonnes per annum at $75.6 per metric tonne. From that point 10 years ago, we roll forward to today to observe an abnormal slight shift of the supply curve to the left with a substantial movement of the demand curve to the right, with significant quantities being supplied to increase world demand, primarily of the emerging nations, including China and India. Rolling forward to the projected 2029 forecast shows the increased productive capacity coming on stream and shifting the supply curve to the right, whilst demand also continues to increase, underpinned by the growth of the emerging nations, most notably India, who picks up the demand growth pattern from China and keeps the Chinese steel production industry operating at high utilization. Therefore, I predict a new supply capacity will be utilized and the iron ore price will hold relatively constant at or around $85 per metric tonne.